A few weeks ago, we got a call, the Historical Society got a call, and it was from John Salas in California, a professional shipwreck diver. He said, what are you in Asbury Park going to do about this 90th anniversary? And when we told him we were having Deborah Whitcraft speak, he said, right on. And wait till you hear her in just a minute. I want to tell you a little bit about her. When Deborah was 16 years old, she started scuba diving. She wound up teaching scuba diving in college. I mean, I can't go into all the things she's done, but she's been a two-term mayor in her town of Beach Haven. She, in fact, the other day I was visiting with her, and she got a call because she's captain of the Beach Haven First Aid Squad. Somebody needed the removal of a fish hook from their foot. But on the serious side, in 2021, Deborah was commemorated, was honored by the state of New Jersey, the New Jersey Assembly, in recognition of her outstanding service and establishing a museum free to the public, preserving the state's maritime history. And everybody that is accessible to you, it's an hour, maybe a half, depending on traffic, don't miss it. So, I'm going to give you Deborah, and I just want you to think about two things. One, think about whether the SS Morro Castle surpasses in history and interest the Titanic. And also, don't you maybe will think that we should have a motion picture about this ship.
Absolutely.
So let Deborah introduce you to all the information. We're very fortunate. Deborah.
First, I want to thank all of you for being here. It means the world to me that this many people, and of course the families of survivors and those who didn't survive, you're the most important people here tonight. But I want to thank all of you for being here because, unfortunately, we don't do a whole lot to preserve our history, especially our maritime history. And yet when Sue mentioned the Titanic, when we built the Maritime Museum, we broke ground exactly 20 years ago this month, and we've been in operation for 18 years. And people come to the Maritime Museum all the time, and they say, what do you have on the Titanic? And I just want to choke them to death. My husband, Jim Vogel, he's all the way back in the corner, probably hiding. Yeah, he still is. He's our unpaid executive director. When we were building the museum, I made him the general contractor, not because he knew anything about building, but because it was cheaper for me to build it that way. So I made him general contractor, and I said, by the way, when you meet with the architect, it's important that one huge room of the museum be dedicated solely to the wreck of the Morro Castle. And he did that. He met with the architect and made sure that I had my special room. And that meant the world to me. So I would just like to thank my husband, who's on the back there, because he's been our executive director for 18 years, and he does an outstanding job. And we hope that most of you, if you've not, how many of you have been to the museum, by the way? Raise your hand. Oh, man. I'm going to look for you, girl. I've never watched YouTube, so I don't know. We've had Mysteries of the Museum, Nat Geo, and a whole bunch of people at the museum at one time or another in these things, but I've never seen them. But anyway, back to the Morro Castle. The reason that I'm such a fanatic about dives and shipwrecks is that when I learned how to dive when I was 16, and I'm going to be 70 next year, when I would dive these wrecks, most of the divers back, I'm going back to 71, were men, And men being men, you know, I look at the shipwreck, and after you surface from the dive, you say to your dive buddy, what was that wreck? And they look at you like you have 3 heads. Because they're into lobsters, they're into spearfishing, but I wanted to know, how did that shipwreck get there? Who did it carry? Was anybody lost? What was its cargo? So, since '71, it launched this obsessive need to research New Jersey shipwrecks. Hence, the building of the Maritime Museum. But the Morro Castle happens to be my absolute favorite. And my co-author and I have been to Cuba 7 times so far, investigating this shipwreck, because American passengers were not the only people lost on this vessel, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But the Morro Castle was built in 1930 in Newport News. It was built at a cost of $5.5 million, most of which was put up by the government. She was a beautiful vessel for her day. And in 1934, this particular voyage was from New York City to Havana, Cuba. The Morro Castle ran regular trips, 6 or 7 day trips for $65. Now $65 doesn't sound like a lot of money. This is during the Depression. So a lot of people would save what money they could for many, many months and take a 7-day voyage aboard the Morro Castle from New York City to Havana, Cuba. It was 2.5 days each way, 2 days in Havana. It was a party cruise. A lot of young people, single young people, went on the Morro Castle to meet other single young people. Now the Morro Castle crew, by the way, it was named, the vessel was named after El Morro, the Morro Castle fortress that guards Havana Bay in Cuba at El Morro. It's a beautiful place. We took this picture, my co-author and I, a couple years, 2 or 3 years ago. As I said, for $65, you could go on this trip. A lot of partying, a lot of alcohol, a lot of dancing. It was a really, really popular trip. In September of 1934, the Morro Castle took its 174th voyage between New York City and Havana, Cuba. Unfortunately, as you can see by this picture here, people got really dressed up. Nowadays, when you go on cruises, it's pretty laid back, and but they really dressed to the nines there. And one of the things on this menu, do you see the broiled Yarmouth bloater? Does anybody know what that is? I have been trying to figure this out for years. You'll see on the menu, broiled Yarmouth bloater. And if you tell me to Google it, I already have. Well, I'm sure it is a fish. It's probably a blowfish of some kind. But, you know, they had lots of dancing, lots of activities on board. It was a party trip. Now, in this particular picture, it was very, very ornate. The Morro Castle was 520 feet length overall. Huge. It was a huge passenger ship with a 70-foot beam. It was a steel-hulled vessel, but all of the furnishings were heavily varnished mahogany, which played a role later on. This photo you see to the right is one of the cabins, and I want you to note the portholes, which we'll get back to later on. Captain Wilmot had over 25 years working for the Ward Line. He was a really popular captain, and he was a real taskmaster. On this trip, in September of 1934, after the Morro Castle left Havana, Cuba, it was reported that the captain was found dead in his cabin. Captain Wilmot was 55 years of age. perfect health, absolutely no significant medical history of any kind. So, the second in command, this is Acting Captain Worms. Although he wasn't the next officer who should have taken command of the vessel, Captain Worms took command of the vessel and continued the trip back to New York City. The problem with this was that there was a gale force nor'easter off the Jersey coast. 6 hours after Acting Captain Worms takes over the operation of the ship, at 2:45 in the morning, he's notified that the ship's on fire. Now, you can see here, this is the writing room of the Morro Castle. This is where the fire originated. Now, Captain Worms, is anybody in here related to Captain Worms, Acting Captain Worms? I gave a talk some years ago and his grandson was there. But I'm still alive. Acting Captain Worms did not have quite the experience to handle this as it was hoped. And on previous trips, when Captain Wilmot needed to take time off, he refused to put Worms in his place and always brought somebody else on. Please tell me you're not here, the grandson. Anyway, so at 2:45 in the morning, it's reported there's a fire in the writing room. For whatever reason, I told you there's a nor'east gale force storm off the Jersey coast. The vessel is heading back to New York. Acting Captain Worms decides that he's going to get that ship back to New York City. Now he's going at 18 knots. 18 knots is about 20 miles an hour. 20 miles an hour doesn't sound very fast, does it? But if you're heading into a gale force wind, it fueled the fire, and it sent this fire the entire length of the vessel. Unfortunately, Acting Captain Worms did not reduce speed. He did not turn that vessel toward the shore. When the fire was first found, at 2:45 in the morning, the radio operator, I don't know how many of you know about Admiralty law, but radio operators at that time were placed aboard passenger vessels by the U.S. government. They were not hired by the company that owned the that owned the Morro Castle, which happened to be the Ward Line. So the U.S. government put the radio operator on the ship. Now understand, there's no survivors left of the Morro Castle, either crewmen or passengers. The radio operator at the time was George Rogers. George Rogers has a responsibility to send the SOS only if it's ordered by the captain. Of course, the captain's dead. We have the acting captain. Depending on who you believe, Worms claims that he instructed George Rogers to send the SOS. George Rogers says, nope, he didn't order it, and 38 minutes later, I couldn't wait any longer, and I sent the SOS. So who knows who's telling the truth? But the bottom line is the SOS was sent. It was picked up across the bay from where we live, and the museum is in Beach Haven. It was picked up by the Tuckerton Wireless. Tuckerton Wireless contacted the Coast Guard. Unfortunately, anybody here from the Coast Guard? Good. The Coast Guard deemed it too unsafe to launch a rescue craft. They did not send a vessel to this. But other vessels knew that the Morro Castle was in trouble. She's burning. When the fire was first detected, she was 10 miles off Barnegat Light. So they sent rescue craft that were already out there in the ocean to pick up people. It wasn't until Many hours later, you had the Monarch of Bermuda, City of Savannah. You had these rescue vessels that were already out in the ocean picking up passengers, but it wasn't until many hours later that the Coast Guard sent the cutter Tampa to the Morro Castle. It was their intent to attach a tow line to the bow of the Morro Castle and tow her closer to the fire boats that had been launched out of New York City. Unfortunately, and again, anything that could have gone wrong did. The tow line got caught in the props and was fouled, and the Morro Castle was dead in the water. So they dropped the anchor, because by now, due to the intensity of the fire and the fact that Acting Captain Worms continued to head into this northeast gale force wind, they lost engine power. So they dropped the anchor to keep the vessel from drifting ashore. Now, what do you notice about this lifeboat? They're crew members. Unfortunately, now the Morro Castle, you can see a picture of her in the exhibit. The Morro Castle had 12 lifeboats, 6 on the port side, 6 on the starboard side. The very first lifeboat, and all due respect to the members of, and I mean this with all my heart, the Torreson family, Tom Torreson, was the most helpful, significant crew member aboard the Morro Castle. Unfortunately, he was the exception to the rule. And in speaking with his grandson, Tom Torreson was only 17 years old. Most of the crew aboard the Morro Castle were very young. Many of them were very inexperienced. Tom Torreson, fortunately, did have some experience, however, being that young. Tom Torreson did everything in his power to try to save the passengers. Most of the crew aboard the Morro Castle did not. The first lifeboat to be dropped, the Morro Castle was still underway. When the lifeboat was dropped, there was nobody in it. And because the ship was still underway, it was gone. 6 lifeboats on either side of the vessel. Only 5 lifeboats were filled. The lifeboats were filled with 85 passengers. One lifeboat had 2 crewmen aboard, including the chief engineer, Abbott, who was seen pulling the insignia off his uniform as the vessel got closer to shore. 85 people came in on 5 lifeboats meant to carry over 400 people. Of those 85 people, how many do you think were passengers?
10.
5. 5 people were passengers. We have some heroes outside of crew members like Tom Torreson. Anybody know the Bogan family in Brielle? They're still in business. They still have a boat called the Paramount. When it was realized that the Coast Guard was not sending a cutter to the Morro Castle to render assistance, these fishermen, the Bogans, one of several fishermen who owned these little 60-foot fishing boats, they decided to call their crews and ask them to volunteer their time to take the fishing boat out and save as many people as they could. And they did. Captain Bogan, you can see the crew down there on the left-hand side. And these men risked their own lives in 8 to 10 foot seas and were able to save 67 people. Now, one of the problems that the Bogan family experienced is that, and I was explaining this to somebody earlier, they were put in a very bad position. They saved 67 people, but they had 72 life jackets. Anybody know why? The reason that there were 5 more jackets than there were people is Captain Bogan was a smart man. He wanted to save as many lives as possible. he instructed his crew that if they came across, for instance, a man and his wife holding on to each other, they were to only bring the living aboard. They were not under any circumstances to bring the dead aboard. It sounds cruel, it sounds heartless, but it was a smart move on his part. So when the crew members, for instance, came across a man and a woman and realized that one of them had passed away, he ordered the crew to push the person through, bring the living on board. Now they're still holding on to the life jacket of their loved one, which explains those 5 extra jackets. But it was a good move on Captain Bogan's part. Unfortunately, he was forced to explain it in a letter, and he obviously felt terrible about the decision he had made, but he probably would not have been able to save 67 people on a 60-foot boat had he not made that decision. Now, I know I'm being hard on the Coast Guard, but they deserve it. Captain Bogan and others verify and confirm the fact that a rescue vessel should have been sent out immediately. That's what they're there for. So much of the documentation that we have at the museum backs up the fact that had they sent a rescue craft sooner than they did, perhaps more could have been saved. One thing they did was they appropriated $1,000 to provide medals for the Bogan, Captain Bogan and his crew, as well as the governor at the time, not the governor, Senator Harry Moore. This man took a private airplane. Remember, this is a gale force storm off the Jersey coast. He took a private airplane, took it off the coast, instructed the crew of these fishing boats that when he tipped his wing, it was to tell them that there was somebody in the water that they need to rescue. So the government provided $1,000 in this bill to give medals to Harry Moore and the Bogan crew for their heroic service. Unfortunately, many of the dead washed ashore or were brought in by other vessels. The local residents in Asbury Park, Belmar, Spring Lake, Seagirt, all up and down the coast had to deal with these, bodies. And it was a gut-wrenching job and responsibility. But to their credit, all of the residents up and down the coast, they emptied out their medicine cabinets. They set up temporary morgue at the Seagirt National Guard camp, but they did everything in their power to render assistance to those who died and to those who survived. You can see here, this is a temporary hospital and at Spring Lake. And like I said, people just emptied out their homes with blankets and everything else. My first aid squad, which I've served on for almost 30 years at Beach Haven, actually was one of many called out to render assistance to the people who needed care after the Morro Castle disaster. This shows you one of the rescue vessels, one of the lifeboats coming ashore. One of the most heroic groups of people were lifeguards up and down the Jersey coast. These lifeguards went out there and saved so many people, but also retrieved many people who didn't make it. This guy here, in my book, and you have to forgive me for this. Does anybody know who John Hagan is? Come on, he's in your turf. No, well, he's in my book. And he looks like a perfect survivor, right? He's not. But I used that because I didn't know who he was, and he's in a Morro Castle lifeboat. So I thought he was a survivor. It turns out he's the wealthiest man in Spring Lake. They call him the Hermit of Spring Lake. He rendered all these patents for water turbines and he worked at the old hotel, the Monmouth Hotel, and because the insurance company required that they had somebody stay in the hotel during the off-season, even though there were no visitors and the hotel was closed, John Hagen lived there, but when the Morro Castle disaster happened, he took up residency in one of the lifeboats. I don't know why. I don't know, but I got a letter. After the book came out in 2012, there was a man, you probably know him, Walter Judge. I know he's not around anymore. He sends me a letter and he says, "Loved your book, but do you know who that man is in your book?" He said, "That's the Spring Lake Hermit." And he told me the story about it. So I just had to explain to you, those of you who have the book, why John Hagen is in there. When he passed away in the 50s, his body was sent to Philadelphia where he was given a proper burial. He was an extremely intelligent engineer and designer of these water turbine patents, but he preferred living as a hermit. Now you can see here, the vessel ended up running aground right in front of Convention Hall, in front of Asbury Park. They made several attempts to tow the vessel back out so that they could tow her to New York, to no avail. Remember, this is a 520-foot vessel. For 8 days, the Morro Castle smoldered. Now you can see here the intensity of the burn. Now remember I mentioned earlier about the portholes? You see these portholes here? Like I said, it was a steel-hulled vessel, heavily varnished mahogany wood. Women, certain women, would have been myself included, tried to escape through the portholes and were hung up at the hip. So these portholes actually resulted in the death of several passengers. I know. Now right here, it says the remains of Captain Wilmot. We don't know if that's Captain Wilmot. Captain Wilmot, once these remains were taken ashore, they could have been anybody. Now forensic science in the 30s was in its infancy. So they couldn't exactly send these remains and test them for the presence of poisons. They did send the cremains to New York City to be tested, but there was never a definitive word and never proof that they were, in fact, Captain Wilmot. His widow built a magnificent granite monument in his memory, but she too admitted that she did not think that the remains there were her husband. But there she is. She sat there, and then due to nor'easters and storms and all that, she sat there in front of Convention Hall for 6 months. 6 months she sat there. Eventually she shifted a little bit, and believe it or not, I know that this sounds horrible, it was an economic boost to Asbury Park. Remember, this was during the Depression. The Morro Castle happened after Labor Day. So all the stores on the boardwalk shut down. Well, they flipped their signs over. They opened up because hundreds of thousands of people headed to Asbury Park to see this smoldering shipwreck. So when they went there, of course, the Board of Inquiry and other people boarded the Morro Castle. So far, the death toll eventually was decided at 137 people. Now you see the lifeboat that's there? The Morro Castle had 6 lifeboats on port, 6 lifeboats on starboard. Only 5 lifeboats were filled, and as I said earlier, 85 people, 5 of whom were passengers. The rest of the lifeboats could not be dropped. They never practiced drills. Captain Wilmot was a real taskmaster. He would order the crew in between trips to paint from bow to stern. When they hit the stern, they painted from stern to bow. There were so many layers of paint in the chain and the davits of these lifeboats that 5 of them could not be dropped. Now we get into the fire. George Rogers is the radio operator. They call him Liver Lips. I didn't come up with the name, the crew did. They called him Liver Lips. Back then, radio operators were not placed on these boats by the company that owned the ship, in this case the Ward Line. George Rogers was placed on the ship by the U.S. government. For whatever reason, the U.S. government never looked at George Rogers' criminal record. George Rogers was a pedophile, an arsonist, terroristic threats. He set fire to a radio business that he owned. He was as crazy as they come. So George Rogers, after the fire, of course he survives. He actually saved some woman's bird. Can't make this up, bird. Cage and all, before jumping in the lifeboat. So George Rogers made it with no problem. And they hailed him as the hero. And he took his act to vaudeville and made some money. So George Rogers, because he's so famous, he gets hired by the Bayonne Police Department. Like I said, you can't make this stuff up. Vincent Doyle is his boss over yonder. Vincent Doyle is a very smart man. Prior to becoming a police officer, Vincent Doyle had a very impressive record, in fire investigations and all that. And he starts asking George all these questions like, where were you? Tell me what you did. George Rogers starts talking about points of origin, accelerants, and all that stuff. How could you possibly know any of this if you didn't set the fire? So George Rogers figures that, I think he knows that I did this. So what does he do? George Rogers decides he needs to kill his boss. Like I said, you can't make this up. It should be a movie, and it better be before I drop dead. So George Rogers, working for the Bayonne Police Department with Lieutenant Vincent Doyle, decides to tell his boss, there's a package on your desk. Well, there was a package, all right. In that package was a bomb that was detonated for the lifting of the lid. Vincent Doyle was not killed. It wasn't that strong a bomb. But he was maimed for life, went into the hospital for months. George Rogers went to prison. Well, just like today, of course, they let him out on good behavior. He didn't serve that long. So he served, I think, 3.5 years. So what's he do? He decides to enlist in the war. So George Rogers goes to war. Well, they gave him a dishonorable discharge because he was setting fires aboard the ship. So they sent his rear end back home. So, like I said, you can't make this up. So George Rogers, Asbury Park made a killing in tourism during the Morro Castle, sitting there. And some bright person got the idea of squashing these pennies, and putting September 8, 1934, and, sold a whole bunch of them. And all the stores reopened and the boardwalk reopened. This little boy here, he lost 2 of his family members on the ship. Dr. Bregstein, this is one of my favorite passengers. He took his little boy, Mervyn, on a cruise aboard the Morro Castle. Yes. Your grandfather's cousin? Yes, the Leone boy. Robert Leone, your cousin. I love this photo, you know? And there's so many sad stories. So this man, who's a dentist, Dr. Breakstein, takes his son Mervyn on a cruise to tell him, now Mervyn's mom had passed away, lost a cancer battle. So he takes Mervyn on a cruise because he meets a new lady. This is years later. Meets a lady that he wants to marry. So he decides he wants to take his boy on a cruise to get his approval, you know, and try to talk to him. Well, somehow during the fire, Dr. Breakstein and Mervyn get separated. And a female passenger grabbed Mervyn and said that she would take care of him. Somehow Mervyn was lost. Mervyn's body was never found. So Dr. Breakstein painted this painting of himself in mourning and created a scholarship fund in memory of his son. His daughter from a later marriage brought that painting and all the records from Mervyn and his dad to the Maritime Museum. This man here calls me up, Don Cumming, 10 years ago, I guess. His family is on vacation. His father wakes him up. You see that little boy? See the little boy in the life ring? That is that elderly man standing there. His family's on vacation. The father wakes him up and says, there's a ship on fire on the beach. And they all race down there. Well, there's two people clinging to a life ring. Undoubtedly, they had been clinging to that life ring for a very long time. Due to the intensity of the nor'easter, the surf was so rough that Don Cumming's father and other people on the beach tried their darndest to wade out as far as they could to save those two people hanging onto that life ring. They didn't make it. So when that life ring came ashore, his father kept it. And then when his dad passed away, it became his. And he donated it to us, which meant the world to us because this is 90 years ago. That life ring on an auction site would go for over $20,000. And I said to Mr. Cumming, I said, before you donate it, you need to know its value. Of course, thinking, please don't change your mind. And he didn't. And he didn't. So it is hanging up in the museum, and we're absolutely honored to have it. My favorite victim, Alma Hill. She is one tough lady. Alma Hill was 27, 28 years old. She was a secretary at an insurance company in New York City. Alma was a good swimmer, good thing. Alma jumped off the ship and swam for 7 hours. She used the Seeger light as her beacon to shore, and she was picked up by the Bogans. Well, people back then, other than men coming home from war, now it's men and women, didn't know much about post-traumatic stress disorder, but Alma was clearly suffering from post-traumatic stress. Someone who found out that she was a passenger aboard the Morro Castle when the ship was set on fire wrote to her father a letter expressing his condolences at the loss of his daughter, when it was later discovered that Alma, in fact, survived. She was picked up by the Bogans, by the Paramount boat, after swimming for 7 hours. So he contacted her father and said, do not open the letter that has been sent to you. And he didn't. It was never opened. So after he passed away, that letter became purse, and she still didn't open it. Now, when she passed away, Alma Hill instructed her daughter to bury that unopened letter with her, which she did. And we have all of her records and correspondence. It's kind of a cool story, but you gotta wonder about the Elgin Watch Company. The Elgin Watch Company, she had a beautiful watch that's now on display in the museum. Elgin watches are expensive. Well, she writes to the Elgin Watch Company and she says, hey, my watch doesn't work. I was in a shipwreck. Well, the Elgin Watch Company writes her back and says, we're really sorry to hear about what happened, but they didn't offer to replace it, and they couldn't fix it, but they asked her permission to use her story in advertising. Sort of tacky, doesn't it think? So we have her watch. But then Alma gets really mad. She writes to the ward line, she said, look, I jumped off your burning ship, and here's an itemized list of everything I left behind after jumping off your burning ship. I think it came to $557 or something like that. Well, believe it or not, they paid her. She was steadfast in making sure that she got paid for it. And there you see, now this ID bracelet says Alma Hill, Glenside, PA. She was a single lady working for the insurance company. When she married and had kids, she never, ever talked about the Morro Castle disaster, just like men coming home from war would only feel comfortable due to post-traumatic stress disorder talking to people who had seen what they saw. She never explained why she wore this bracelet. It says Alma Hill, Glenside, PA. When she died, and her daughter was settling the estate and cleaning out stuff from her attic, she came across her diary. And Alma Hill explains how for 7 hours, using the cedar light as her beacon to shore, the only thing she could think about, remember this fire was started at 2:45 in the morning. The only thing she could think about was, I don't have any identification on me. So she never again, she explained in her diary, she never again wanted to ever be in a position where if something happened to her, nobody would know who she was. So this ID bracelet stayed on her until her daughter removed it prior to burial. Now the 134 lost or missing, the real number is actually 137 from the passenger list, but what our government didn't want to admit at the time is that the Morro Castle, for 3.5 years that it operated from New York City to Havana, Cuba, it brought back many Cuban children from Cuba. Their families had made arrangements for these children to be raised in boarding homes in New York City. There was so much bloodshed in the streets of Havana under the dictatorship of Batista that people would pay these, remember these men made next to nothing as crewmen. Some of the crew aboard the Morro Castle weren't paid at all. They just got a bunk to sleep in and leftovers from the passengers. But there were Cuban children always smuggled onto the ship. So the 137 that we have who died from the passenger list do not take into consideration those who were smuggled aboard because they weren't on the passenger list. This is before they knew that asbestos was a carcinogen. They used the Morro Castle disaster to promote the use of asbestos in ships before they realized that it caused cancer. Now, for those of you who haven't been in the museum yet, I'm proud to say that we have the largest collection of Morro Castle documentation, records, Board of Inquiry documents, FBI files, except we don't have prison records because Trent State Prison says they don't have any from George Rogers or Bruno Hoffman. They disappeared. So, we're still trying to get them. But like I said, when we were building the museum, I told Jim, make sure you have a Morro Castle room because there's so much stuff that's important, that's being preserved. This jacket here, which I think we brought the jacket here, yes. This jacket was actually worn by a lady, Ellen Brody Hoy, who jumped off with a relative. She survived, her relative did not. Helen Brody Hoy, initially, they didn't know that she had survived. They threw her unconscious body on top of others who didn't make it. And then somebody on the beach saw her hand move. So Helen Brody Hoy was rescued and given medical attention. Many years ago, I know this sounds really crazy, but this jacket I bought back in Christie's. They valued it at $4,000 or $5,000 many years ago. Yeah, 20 years ago it was valued at that. I bought it on an auction site, but I didn't get the jacket. I was really mad. So I left, this is on eBay, I left really bad feedback for the seller, and I called him a deadbeat. I was mayor of Beach Haven at the time, and I got a phone call from a guy saying, you don't know me, but you bid on a jacket that my friend was selling, and you left him feedback that he was a deadbeat. I did. He said, well, he is dead. So after I took my foot out of my mouth, I said, I'm really sorry. The guy lived alone, and he died, and nobody knew. So of course I didn't get the guy his friend was really nice. He said, I'm just calling to see if you still want the jacket. Yeah, he did. So he did send it to me. So Helen Brody Hoy's jacket is on display here. He did forgive me. Anyway, this book, this menu, you see George Rogers' signature, third from the top. Like I said, we have the largest collection of Morro Castle memorabilia anywhere in the world. George Rogers, he was the hero, and he had no problem signing people's menus. Now, I was talking to somebody earlier. These 6 books have been written about the Morro Castle. The first one was written in 1935, but it was not permitted in the United States for decades. It was written in German, and it's titled The Last Day of a Ship. And it talks about the politics that were going on between the United States and Cuba under the dictatorship. And it's an interesting book. I did have it translated in English. The other books, including my own that I wrote with Gretchen Coyle, Inferno at Sea, these are 6 different books, all of which were written about the Morro Castle. So here we are 90 years later. Now, when the Morro Castle sat there in Asbury Park, she actually sat there for 6 months. Now, the Asbury Park, fortunately, nobody who was in office back then is alive. But the governing body of Asbury Park, it was such a draw for tourists. I mean, businesses were making a killing. So they actually met with the ward line to try to make arrangements to keep the ship there because it drew so many people. There was a problem with that, which they didn't know about. The Morro Castle had a cargo of untreated animal hides aboard her. Every time the wind came from the ocean, the stench of decomposing animal hides drove people off the beach. So they decided, oops, we're going to take this $5.5 million ship and get her out of here. Ultimately, they first towed her to New York, which was stupid, because there was nothing to salvage from this vessel. They then took her under tow, took her back to Baltimore, where she was cut up for scrap metal. $34,000 in scrap metal was received from this. There it is. Yes, there's the book in German. It's pretty cool. But you see that port anchor there? Have you read about the discovery of the starboard anchor? Well, Bill Cleary is a good friend of ours, and he's a member of the museum. and he happened to have found the starboard anchor. What happened was a commercial fisherman got his gear, fluke fishing, got his gear caught on this anchor. He gave the numbers of this anchor to Bill Cleary and said, hey, if you could get my equipment back, my gear back, you know, it's a lot of money. Commercial fishermen lose a lot of money in gear due to shipwrecks and obstructions. Well, Bill didn't tell me anything about this. He was smart. But he came to the museum, spent many, many hours in research, but he would never tell me what he was researching. But it was in the Morro Castle room. So, sure enough, he recovers the anchor. Well, a man happens to come in the museum whose last name is Bolt, B-A-L-D-T. It's the manufacturer. His family owned the company that made the anchor for the Morro Castle. So we were able to unequivocally determine that this anchor was in fact the starboard anchor. When the Morro Castle dropped anchor about between 2.5 to 3 miles off Cedar, they ultimately had to cut it, and the vessel came ashore, of course, in front of Asbury Park. But when Bill Cleary recovered this anchor along with Paul Whitaker, a state police officer, they did everything in their power to confirm the fact that this was the Morro Castle's starboard anchor. And its ultimate disposition, we do not know. It's either going to go in Asbury Park near the monument, or it may go in front of the New Jersey Maritime Museum. We don't know, but we're just thrilled that Bill and Paul Whitaker and their crew recovered this anchor. Now, 90 years later, on the anniversary of the Morro Castle, you know that 6 books have been written. We have been trying desperately to get somebody to do a documentary. We've had, Mysteries at the Museum do a 15-minute thing, right, Jim? And we've had small documentaries being done, but there's so much to this shipwreck. And there's so many unanswered questions, especially about George Rogers, about the fact that this vessel was carrying millions of dollars in munitions to Cuba at a time when people were standing in bread lines during the Depression. There's so much secrecy 90 years later. When we filed a Freedom of Information demand for documents, we received 40-pound boxes at the museum, 2/3 of which were blackened out. It's been 90 years. The story of the Morro Castle, the story of heroes like the Torreson, Tom Torreson, Father Egan aboard the vessel, and others. There are heroes among the crew members. Their stories need to be told, but just as importantly, the stories of the survivors and those who didn't survive need to be told. So it is our hope and our prayer that before the 100th anniversary of this, I hope to be alive for it, that somebody, the man in blue, does a full-length documentary about this wreck so that the American people, the survivors and the families of those who did not know the real story. Now, before I open it up to questions and answers, I would like to ask Pat to come forward, the grandson of Tom Torreson, to share something that he prepared for this presentation tonight. And by the way, his mom, Sue Gazzara, provided us with all the documentation of Tom Torreson and his role during the Morro Castle disaster, for which we are very, very grateful. And any of you folks who have families who were either passengers, crew members, or relatives of these people, if you don't mind sharing what you have, we don't need to keep the originals. We just need to be able to copy them so that they're preserved for future generations. Pat?
Hi, everybody. How you doing? My mom was going to come tonight and she was going to give some remarks, but she wasn't able to make it, so I prepared something on her behalf. Good evening. Thank you to Kay Harris and the members of the Asbury Park Historical Society, as well as all the folks who helped plan tonight's event, for giving my family the opportunity to take part in this remembrance. My name is Pat Gazzara, and I'm the grandson of Thomas Torsten, who served as a crew member on the Morro Castle. My mom, Sue Torsten Gazzara, had planned to attend this event, but she unfortunately had to cancel at the last minute. However, my brother, Chris Gazzara, and my uncle Skip Torsten and his wife Joanne are here, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce them. Our family is here tonight because the tragedy of the Morro Castle played such a significant role in my grandfather's life and in the lives of his children and his grandchildren. Even today, it's hard to wrap my mind around the fact my grandfather was only a 17-year-old third assistant purser when the Morro Castle burned. He was a teenager who showed a tremendous amount of bravery on that September day 90 years ago. He told us many stories over the years, especially of his time swimming through the water with a young boy named Bobby Gonzalez clinging to his back. The boy was critically burned, and these two boys, both children, talked, sang, and prayed together until my grandfather realized this child had passed away on his back. My grandfather carried that boy's memory with him every day for the rest of his life. The trauma my grandfather experienced that day shaped the man he became and the lessons he taught his children and grandchildren. He taught us to always be aware of our surroundings. He taught us to have a plan to deal with any situation and escape from it if necessary. He taught us to evaluate the reality of any situation and do the right thing and to deal with it. My mom told me recently that she truly believes her father learned those lessons as he was trapped between the ocean and the fire. My grandfather also made it his mission to push for safety changes in cruise ships, especially accessibility throughout any ship in the event of a disaster. He remembered struggling with other crew members to reach passengers who needed help, but were unfortunately blocked by a fire. As cruise ships got larger, he lived in fear of ever seeing a fire disaster like the Morro Castle account. He had a healthy respect for the sea. My mom told us frequently of their family's trips to and from Europe on military transports, when my grandfather was assigned to bases in Germany. My grandfather made sure the family took part in every lifeboat drill that was offered. He learned many lessons from his experiences on the Morro Castle and passed them on to his family. One thing I know for certain, he always kept the memories of the souls lost that day in a special place in his heart. Thank you again for continuing to tell the stories of the Morro Castle and keeping these memories alive in our hearts. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Good thing that came out of the Morro Castle is that safety at sea dramatically changed. The requirement for drills, showing people how to properly don life jackets. When you look at the life jacket in there, the fact that they never had a drill, never showed people how to properly don a life jacket, played a huge role in the number of people who died in this disaster. Some people, when they jumped from the ship, depending on what level they were, it was a 30, 40, 50-foot drop to the water. If they didn't hold that life jacket against their chest, one of two things happened. The jacket came off altogether from them, or it came under their chin and broke their neck, rendering them unconscious, face down in the water. So the Morro Castle disaster served to change the rules for safety at sea, the requirement for life drills, lifeboats. 3.5 years, these lifeboats had never been lowered. Most of the passengers didn't even know where their life jackets were. So one good thing that came out of this is that safety at sea is now required of all passenger vessels. By the way, did I tell you that they got $34,000 in scrap metal for this ship? $5.5 million, $34,000. Japan bought that scrap metal. They sent it back to us. I would like to thank all of you and open this up to anyone who has any questions.
I also wanted, before you do the questions, were there any other families of descendants that I did not realize were in attendance? Okay. And I also want to acknowledge. Okay, good. And I want to acknowledge Ellen, Carol back there, and J.T. Stedman, DJ T, our DJ, and Carol Ellen, everybody knows her, who owns the Coastal newspaper, and she's been very supportive of the Historical Society and the Asbury Park Museum over the years. She's also
I'd like to remind everyone, if you have any information at all, especially the family members of those who sailed aboard the Morro Castle, it is important that we preserve their memories and anything concerning this disaster. So if there's anything that you would like to share with the New Jersey Maritime Museum, with the Asbury Park Historical Society, we don't have to keep the originals. We just make copies of them because the story needs to be told and it needs to be preserved. So we're very thankful that all of you are here, and we hope you'll keep the passengers and crew of the Morro Castle in your memories. Thank you.
also the Margolis family were descendants of Agnes Prince. Nice enough to make copies of one of the articles, and there's enough for everybody. So when you do leave, they're going to be on a table out front, so please help yourself to the prayer. We're not over yet. We still have the cake cutting and toast, and this is still an opportunity to ask questions. I just want to get this in. And okay, so questions.
I don't have a question, but I have a funny story about something. We have a station in Long Beach, Trinity, thank you. And I wanted to get Tom something special for Father's Day. And we were in this Mary's antique place. And I saw a sink that very ornate, probably made in Spain, and it had from Morro Castle and the date. And I said, Skip, that's perfect to get your father. I don't know what to do with it, but maybe it's a different plan, something like that. And it cost $100. And I said, he'll love it. So we bring it home, we give it to him, and he said, that's not from the Morro Castle. And it was no turns. Well, I was shocked. I mean, he knew everything about the ship. He said, that is not a sink from the Maritime. So I took it back and fortunately I got my money back.
One of the problems with the Morro Castle had so many layers of paint on here that, like I said, half of the lifeboats could not be lowered because they were stuck in their davits, and it was an oil-based paint. So when the fire was set aboard the Morro Castle, one of the passengers called it or described it as a prairie grass fire. And we had, you remember Nora Mushanek from Channel 6 Action News? The last two survivors of the Morro Castle were interviewed at our museum. It was a great interview. And Marjorie Giannini and Jerry Edgerton. Jerry Edgerton was a 17-year-old boy, and they're sitting there in the Morro Castle room, and the TV crew is filming, and Marjorie backhands Jerry. Oh dear, we're having a rumble at the Maritime Museum. So she says to Jerry, I want to know where you were when this fire was set. I mean, she demanded an answer right then and there. And of course, they're filming this. So Jerry Edgerton walks up to a table and he says, Mrs. Giannini, this is what I did. I was a 17-year-old farmer. I hitchhiked across the country. He didn't know port from starboard, bow from stern. He'd never been on a ship in his life. So he walks over to the table in the museum and he says, I stood there at the railing, and because it was an oil-based paint on the deck, he said it looked like a prairie grass fire. And he said he stood on one foot until the sole was burned. And then he changed feet until that sole burned. And then he jumped overboard. Well, for some reason, this was bothering Marjorie Giannini so bad that she was comforted by his explanation. He said, after both soles were burnt and my skin was burning, I jumped. And she was happy. But they were the last two survivors of the Morro Castle, and we were thrilled to have been able to interview them. There are no survivors now. Anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned about the anchor, about its possibility going to two different places. Can you say where it is now and who's making the decision on where it's going to wind up?
Bill Cleary is the man who recovered the anchor along with Paul Whitaker, and she has to go through, an intense preservation bath and all that. I don't think Bill has made a decision yet. He owns a couple restaurants in the area, so it's either going to go in Asbury Park near the monument there, or it's going to go in front of the Maritime Museum. I don't think either decision is fine with us.
Is it viewable by the public currently?
No, it is not.
Okay.
No,
Thank you.
it is not. But if you stay in touch with us or call me at the museum, I can give you information of when it will be able to be seen. It's 10,000 pounds, that anchor. And kudos to him for recovering it. Yes, sir.
Have you seen that anchor yourself, ma'am?
I've only seen pictures that Bill has sent me.
Okay.
Just pictures. But there's no doubt whatsoever that he did, in fact, find the starboard anchor of the Morro Castle. All the records from the boat company verify that it is, in fact, that. I had to laugh. I mean, he spent 100 hours or more in the museum. And every time I'd come in the Morro Castle room, he'd close whatever he's working. Good job. Yes, sir.
Deborah, my mother was 17 years old at the time of the Morro Castle disaster, and she lost her mother, her father, and her grandmother on that shipboard fire. And actually, it was probably nearly 50 years later, she wrote an account of that day.
I have it. Kay Harris shared it with me because you gave it to the Asbury Park. I read it yesterday and I was astounded at what she had to say. What really got me, and I told my husband, Jim, I said, this 14 years old and 17 years old. Her brother was 14. And she had to pick out the dress for the funeral.
But I had my son, I could not get through it, so I was asked my son if he would read it.
Oh, absolutely. It broke my heart when I read it. I was honored to have been given a copy of it. And we are doing a sequel to Inferno at Sea, and we want to include the stories of everyone that we can, because the people need to be heard. They need to be heard.
Would you like to hear it?
Oh, absolutely.
It's a,
Why don't you read it from this? This is
no, this is much easier.
really
Drop page. So, yeah, and I think that this was written in '83, just before the 50th anniversary. She says, on September 8th, 1934, I woke up to a cloudy, dismal day after a stormy and thunderstorm-filled night. However, the weather did not bother me as there was a song in my heart. This was the day my brother Donald and Oma, as we affectionately called our mother's mother, and I were going to New York City to welcome our mom and dad home. Oh, what a happy day. After breakfast, we dressed and walked a few blocks to the Fresh Pond Road train station to take the train into New York. As we approached the station, I saw a headline in the morning paper that made my blood run cold. Morro Castle ablaze, 650 feet doomed. I will never forget that headline. My heart stopped. This was the ship my mom and dad were on. This couldn't be. There must be some mistake, I reasoned. It probably was a small fire and the media had blown it all out of proportion. This was a beautiful, new, and safe ship, I was told by one of the stewards who proudly showed my girlfriend and I around the day we went to see my parents off. He said if there was a fire, it could easily be contained because of all the fireproof doors and alarms and the fireproof materials. This satisfied me as I had seen a movie, Whom the Gods Destroy, a few days before Mom and Dad's cruise, and I begged them not to go. You see, my mom was dreadfully afraid of fire and wasn't too thrilled about a ship either. They really went to satisfy my grandmother, who wanted to go very much. She was 79 years old. We continued our train trip, and all the while we prayed that it would not be a serious fire and that all would be taken care of by the time we arrived to take them home. However, after arriving at the dock, there were crowds of people running all around the place trying to find out some information about their loved ones. It was bedlam. Some of the people who came off the ship were calling home to let their relatives know they were safe. They had been taken off the Morro Castle by other boats and returned to the dock. Oma then thought perhaps Mom and Dad should try to reach us at home, and nobody was there to answer the phone. Oma said she would go home to wait for a call, and Don and I should stay there until we saw Mom and Dad come off the boat and come home with them. People were crying and holding on to each other, and Don and I kept looking and going up to the information desk where they had a list of passengers that had been rescued, but no word about our parents. We were desperate and waited for hours, and hoping and praying and never giving up hope that they too would be all right. When the media saw us alone, the old and children there, Don was 14 and I was 17, they plagued us with their questions, taking pictures of us. They were not very kind with their questions. They wanted to know all about us. By this time, we were both in tears and blurted out about the movie I had seen and how I begged them not to go on the cruise. Finally, two of my parents' friends showed up. They came and they had heard that we were there alone and came to be with us and take us home. We were so relieved to see a familiar face and that they took us away from the cameras. Still no word of our parents, and it was 6 o'clock at night. The only information we had is that the Morro Castle was beached on Asbury Park in New Jersey, and people were coming in on any kind of boats that were available. Passengers were brought to many hospitals, and some had died. Who and how many, no one knew. All the information was sketchy, no organization or order at all. No one seemed to be in charge. We kept calling home periodically, but Oma hadn't heard anything either. After watching and waiting until 8:30 p.m., our friends Mildred and Herbert decided we should all go home. Upon arriving home, we heard there was still no news. Being completely drained and exhausted, I flung myself across my mom's bed and cried myself to sleep. Hearing the telephone ring, I lay very quietly to hear the conversation. I heard my Oma was talking to my cousin from New Jersey, who said, "Then we have the three of them." Loretta, my cousin from New Jersey, said she had been looking all night for and finally found my mom, who had been washed ashore at Seagirt, New Jersey. Mom was in a funeral home there. I found out later that while I slept, Daddy and his mother were pulled out of the water and taken to Bellevue Morgue. We had received a telephone call from the morgue, and I was devastated. Also on that day, my Aunt Lolly, my Oma's sister from Staten Island, Aunt Helen, Mom's sister, Uncle Russ, and her husband, and I drove to Seagirt, where I identified my mom. Mom looked so peaceful, and when they showed me the clothing she had been wearing, they were the black skirt and yellow blouse I had given her the previous Mother's Day. So, my aunt inquired on the funeral home director if Mom had any jewelry on her, and we were told to go to a private house nearby and inquire there. We did, and upon my describing the jewelry, it was given to me. We were lucky to get it. There had been reports that as bodies were washed ashore, they were being robbed of their possessions. We arrived home very late that night, and all of us were totally exhausted. The next day, my girlfriend and I went to the store to buy Mom's burial dress. The clerk, not only knowing it was a dress from my mother, said she can exchange it if she doesn't like it. I broke down in tears, and again the clerk felt terrible after she learned of the tragedy. I assured her it was all right, as she had no way of knowing. My next terrible ordeal was to choose the 3 caskets. It was an unbearable task for me, but Oma was beside herself and couldn't do it. My aunts were helpful, but most of the decisions were left to me. It was a nightmare. I just wanted to wake up. Crowds of people came to see the triple funeral. I will never, never forget. There were so many beautiful flowers and you could hardly get in the room. The world crumbled. I took a long, long walk after the funeral and couldn't believe the sun could shine and people were going to work as usual. How could I ever live without them? I wanted to die. They were the best parents anyone could ever have. Mom and I had been so close. She was my best friend. We had been such a happy and loving family, and now it was just Donald and me. How could we go on? Somehow life does go on one day at a time. Years later, blessed with a wonderful, thoughtful, and compassionate husband and beautiful, loving, caring children and grandchildren, I again had a happy family. I always felt Mom and Dad had been with me and my family all our life and was smiled down upon us always. I feel I was taught a very costly but valuable lesson in values, and it has always stayed with me. Material things are unimportant. Only a loving and caring family and living with the Lord is necessary for happiness.
I read that for the first time yesterday, and Kay shared the photos that you sent her, and I'm just thrilled to be able to add that to our archives. Thank you very, very much. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am. Sure.
So it seems like you think Captain Wilmot was not, he didn't die from natural causes, he was killed.
Well, this lady is asking, and how are you related to the Leone boy?
My grandfather's cousin.
Grandfather's cousin, yeah. Yeah, that picture's heart-wrenching. But she's asking
If you think that Captain Wilmot
about Captain Wilmot's death at the age of 55. When she was interviewed, his widow, he had no prior significant medical history whatsoever. The surgeon aboard the ship, Surgeon Dr. Van Zyl, he, unfortunately, when he jumped into the props. He didn't make it. But Dr. Van Zyl claimed first that he died of indigestion, and then that he had a heart attack. Of course, there's no way of knowing because you can't do an autopsy on a cruise ship. But it is thought, and I have it in my records, that before the ship left Havana, Cuba, the termination papers had been served on George Rogers, the radio operator, because Wilmot found him to be, he didn't get along with the crew members, he was disrespectful to passengers, and he was witnessed by 2 crew members telling George Rogers that he didn't care if the government put him aboard the ship as the radio operator. When the ship got back to New York, he'd never work for the ward line again. Next thing you know, he's dead.
My question was, do you think the same person could possibly set fire to the ship as the person responsible?
Absolutely. I would bet on it. I would bet that George Rogers, his boss, Vincent Doyle, he told his boss, Vincent Doyle, too much information for someone who did not start the fire. When you're talking about points of origin and accelerants used, and why George Rogers felt it necessary to try to kill his boss, everything that I have found points to George Rogers. It cannot be proven, but I would bet on it. I would bet on it that George Rogers is responsible for both. But, yes.
I just wanted to say, before this all started, so serendipitous, the sun was coming through that window, and we just read the quote up there. It's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that is so cool. Yes, it really is. But the thing about the Morro Castle, it really, it's sad. It's such a horrific tragedy that happened right here. And yet, you go out in the street and you ask the average person, what do you know about the Morro Castle? They have no idea. But it was such a horrific tragedy and it played such a huge role in changing the laws of safety at sea. And yet our schools, I don't know what our schools are teaching, I don't have any kids, but it just seems to me that we're allowing such important history to just be forgotten. And hopefully with all of you, it won't happen. And hopefully we'll all be here for the 100th anniversary. Yes, sir.
So years ago at DC, I was in Smithsonian. Part of the American Museum was a nautical section, up a couple floors. And I remember walking up the whole wall was a convention hall in Morro Castle. I don't know if you ever saw that.
I did, I have not.
It's insane. It was insane. Beautiful display.
Is it still there?
No, they took it down. But they must have it. So they wanted to acquire the Smithsonian.
Oh, I
They must
absolutely,
have that boxed up.
oh, I absolutely
It
will.
was incredible. Back then I had
How many years ago did you see that?
30 years ago. But they probably still have it.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the archive.
Yeah, well, what all did you see on display?
Excuse me?
What did you see on display?
Life jacket. It's very similar things we have here, but it was a lot. It was all dedicated to Morro Castle in one section. There was other ships, other disasters, but they said it was the largest maritime disaster in the U.S. and it was advertised.
I will find out about that. When we acquire artifacts at the museum, we recently, well not recently, many years ago, acquired shipwreck artifacts from the 1827 shipwreck of the Aurora off Sandy Hook. And the divers who discovered this wreck contacted the Smithsonian because they needed help in identifying it. And the Smithsonian didn't give them the time of day, which really annoyed the hell out of them. So we ended up with their entire collection of shipwreck artifacts from the Aurora and an Octon and an 1805 Battle of Trafalgar medal. And it wasn't until these artifacts were delivered to us that the Smithsonian showed an interest. So we haven't had much luck with them, but I will check on that. Thank you. 30 years ago, at least. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Do you have anything from the new era at your museum?
The new era, most people know 1854, the new era shipwreck is in exactly the same spot that the Morro Castle was lost. If we have any artifacts from the new era, we're not aware of it. We have many, many artifacts that have never been identified in terms of the identity of the ship. But remember, 1854, when the new era took place, I mean, you've had so much of that wreck pile up and wash up and down the coast. And we have what's called contaminated wreck sites. When I started diving in 53 years ago, many of the wrecks that we explored were contaminated wreck sites. We had one off Brigantine that we found artifacts from the late 1700s, Revolutionary War time artifacts, and then we found artifacts from the mid-1800s. So clearly, the original ship went down. Decades later, a second vessel struck the hull of the original ship, breaking up on that exact spot. But with the new era being as old as it is, it's probably impossible to tell artifacts that we have to date them back to that wreck. I wish I did know the identity of some of the artifacts that we have.
A lot of people say that was the catalyst to start the Coast Guard in the United States because of the great loss of life on the new era, that there was so catastrophic that there were no safety regulations, that was the spark to start the Coast Guard.
Believe it or not, the catalyst for starting the U.S. Life-Saving Service actually happened on Long Beach Island. A man who, William A. Newell, who later became governor of New Jersey, observed a shipwreck there. At the time, it was called Great Swamp, and there were 13 sailors climbing the mast of this vessel, this Austrian brig, and he watched as each one of them dropped into the sea and drowned. He was a medical doctor, and he was so, I think 1848 that happened, he was so distraught watching these men drop off the masts and drown, that when he was later elected to Congress, he added $10,000 in appropriations to a bill to create what then became the U.S. Life-Saving Station. So it wasn't the new era, it was the Paraisto shipwreck in Great Swamp, now known as Surf City, that resulted in the formation of the U.S. Life-Saving Service. By the way, years ago, I went to the National Archives when I was a diver and I wanted to know about these wrecks. And I said, look, the Life-Saving Service was in existence for 39 years, 1876 until 1914, then they became the Coast Guard in 1915. I said, there's 39 years of records on shipwrecks, and I want to review them. They only had 11. This is our nation's library. Well, I'm happy to say it took over 25 years, but we have all 39 years of the U.S. Life-Saving Service records. But William A. Newell, the governor of New Jersey, later elected to Congress, is responsible for the creation of the U.S. Life-Saving Service. I want to say.